She walked into the courtroom, wearing a red dress meant for a gala, not a divorce hearing. Jessica Vance didn't just want Mark Kensington's money. She wanted his wife Sarah to feel every ounce of her insignificance. She slapped a $40,000 Birkin bag onto the legal table, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. She thought she had won. She thought the quiet woman in the grey cardigan sitting across from her was a nobody, a charity case Mark had picked up in college. Jessica laughed, flashing a diamond ring the size of a grape, oblivious that the doors behind her were about to open for a man who didn't just have money. He owned the banks. And he wasn't happy. The atmosphere inside courtroom 304 was thick enough to choke on. On the left side of the aisle sat Mark Kensington, the CEO of Kensington Tech, a man recently featured on the cover of Forbes as a self-made visionary. He adjusted his bespoke Italian suit, checking his reflection in the polished wood of the defense table. He looked confident, bored, and utterly dismissive of the woman sitting across from him. Next to him sat Jessica Vance. She wasn't a lawyer, and technically she shouldn't have been sitting at the counsel table, but Mark's high-priced attorney, Robert Sterling, hadn't the spine to tell her to move. Jessica was the physical embodiment of new money. She wore a blood-red designer dress that hugged every curve, clashing violently with the somber tone of a divorce hearing. Her wrist was weighed down by a solid gold Cartier bangle, and she kept checking her phone, sighing loudly every time the proceedings slowed down. On the right side sat Sarah Kensington. If Jessica was a neon sign, Sarah was a shadow. She wore a faded grey cardigan, her hair pulled back in a simple, messy bun. She wore no jewelry, not even her wedding ring. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap. To the casual observer, she looked defeated. She looked like a woman who had ridden her husband's coattails for 10 years and was now about to be thrown out onto the street. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Anthony Harrison said, peering over his spectacles, "we are here to discuss the division of assets. Your client, Mr. Kensington, is contesting the alimony request. Is that correct?" Robert Sterling stood up, smoothing his tie. "That is correct, Your Honor. My client, Mr. Kensington, built Kensington Tech from the ground up. Mrs. Kensington has not been employed for the duration of their 10-year marriage. She has contributed nothing to the estate. In fact, she has been a drain on my client's resources." Mark smirked, leaning back in his chair. He didn't even look at Sarah. "A drain?" Judge Harrison asked, raising an eyebrow. "They have been married for a decade, Counselor. New York is an equitable distribution state." "Financial contribution, Your Honor," Sterling pressed. "She brought zero capital into the marriage. She has no family connections, no inheritance, and no career. Mr. Kensington believes that the prenuptial agreement, though currently contested by opposing counsel, should stand. She gets the apartment in Queens and $50,000. That is generous." $50,000. Mark was worth $3 billion. Jessica Vance couldn't help herself. She let out a sharp, derisive laugh. It was loud enough that the court stenographer paused her fingers, hovering over the keys. "Excuse me," Judge Harrison snapped, looking at Jessica. "Is something funny, Ms. Vance?" Jessica didn't stand up. She just smirked, twirling a lock of her blonde hair. "I'm sorry, Judge. It's just 50,000. That wouldn't even cover the catering for the engagement party Mark and I are planning. It's just funny thinking she expects to live on that." The courtroom went silent. The disrespect was palpable. Sarah's lawyer, a court-appointed public defender named Mr. Higgins, looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. He was overworked, underpaid, and clearly intimidated by Mark's legal team. He stood up shakily. "Your Honor, my client..." Sarah. She supported Mr. Kensington while he was coding his first software. She worked 2 jobs as a waitress. Waitress money, Jessica whispered loudly to Mark, giggling. Cute. Mark leaned over to Jessica, whispering back, Don't worry, babe. We'll be out of here by lunch. Then we can go pick up that new Porsche. Sarah finally looked up. Her eyes weren't wet with tears. They were cold. They were a shade of blue that usually belonged to glaciers. She looked at Mark, then at Jessica. Mark, Sarah said softly. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a strange authority that cut through the murmuring. Address the bench, not the defendant, Sterling barked. Sarah ignored him. Mark, are you sure you want to do this? I offered you a clean break. I didn't ask for half. I didn't ask for the company. I just asked for you to respect the time we spent together. Mark scoffed. Respect Sarah, look at you. You're a mouse. You've always been a mouse. I need a lioness. He grabbed Jessica's hand and kissed it theatrically. I need someone who fits my world. You belong back in the trailer park I saved you from. Saved me, Sarah repeated. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. Is that how you remember it? That's the reality, Mark sneered. You're a nobody, Sarah. A ghost. And after today, you won't even be a Kensington. Thank God for that, Sarah murmured. What was that? Judge Harrison asked. Nothing, Your Honor, Sarah said, returning to her composure. I just wish to state that the trailer park my husband refers to, he never actually visited my home, did he? Mark rolled his eyes. Why would I visit a dump? You met me at university. You were on a scholarship. Probably a hardship fund. Jessica leaned forward, placing her elbows on the table, causing her diamond bracelets to clatter. Look, honey, she addressed Sarah directly. Let's speed this up. Mark bought me this watch last week. She tapped the face of a diamond-encrusted Patek Philippe. It cost more than your lawyer makes in a year. Just sign the papers, take the cash, and go find a nice waiter to marry. Stop embarrassing yourself by trying to fight people who are out of your league. Sarah looked at the watch. Then she looked at the clock on the wall. It was 10:58 a.m. You're right, Jessica, Sarah said. Time is very valuable. And I believe my time is just about up. What are you babbling about? Mark asked, annoyed. I didn't want to do this, Sarah said, standing up. She didn't look like a mouse anymore. She stood with a posture that was almost military-grade, straight. I wanted to spare you the embarrassment, Mark. I really did. I tried to settle this quietly. Sit down, Mrs. Kensington, the judge warned. I can't, Your Honor, Sarah said politely but firmly, because the jurisdiction of this court is about to change. Excuse me, the judge frowned. My father, Sarah said, smoothing her grey cardigan. He's a very protective man. He didn't like the voicemail you left me, Mark, the one where you threatened to fabricate evidence about my mental health. Mark paled slightly. He heard it, Sarah interrupted, and he decided to come pick me up. Your father, Jessica laughed, a shrill, hyena-like sound. Who is he? The manager of a Burger King. Just then, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom didn't just open, they flew open. 2 men in dark suits walked in first. They weren't court security. They wore earpieces and lapel pins that looked like crests. They scanned the room with professional paranoia. Hey, you can't just barge in here, the bailiff shouted, reaching for his belt. One of the men in suits held up a hand, flashing a badge that wasn't NYPD. It was diplomatic security. Make way, the agent said, his voice booming. Make way for who? Judge Harrison stood up, outraged. This is my courtroom. Not anymore, it isn't, a deep voice thundered from the hallway, and then he walked in. The man who entered the courtroom was a giant both in stature and presence. He was in his 60s, with a mane of silver hair and a beard that looked like it had been carved from granite. He wore a suit that made Mark's bespoke Italian tailoring look like a costume from a thrift store. But it wasn't the suit. It was the aura. This was a man who didn't ask for permission. He took it. Behind him trailed 3 more assistants, one carrying a briefcase, the others simply creating a perimeter. The courtroom gasped. Even Judge Harrison froze. He recognized the face. Everyone recognized the face. He wasn't a movie star, and he wasn't a politician. He was bigger. That's... Mark's lawyer, Sterling, dropped his pen. His mouth hung open. That's Alexander Vane. Jessica blinked, confused. Who? Alexander Vane. Mark whispered, the color draining from his face faster than water down a drain. The King of Steel. Vane Industries. He owns half the shipping lines in Europe. He's the unofficial monarch of the Mediterranean economy. Alexander Vane didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at Mark. He walked straight toward the defense table, his heavy footsteps echoing on the floorboards. He stopped in front of Sarah. The room held its breath. Was he here to sue someone? Was he lost? Sarah sighed, looking at the giant man. Papa, I told you I could handle it. Papa. The word hung in the air, heavy and impossible. Jessica Vance's jaw literally dropped. She looked from the billionaire tycoon to the woman in the grey cardigan. Papa, she squeaked. Alexander Vane looked down at Sarah, his hard expression softening instantly. He took her hand and kissed her forehead. I know you wanted to handle it, Sarai, but when I hear that a little rodent is trying to steal my daughter's dignity, I tend to get on a plane. He turned slowly, his body rotating like a tank turret, until he was facing Mark and Jessica. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Alexander Vane's eyes were the same blue as Sarah's, but where hers were glaciers, his were flamethrowers. So, Alexander said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in Mark's chest. This is the visionary. Mark stood up, his legs shaking. Mr. Vane, I had no idea. Sit down, Alexander commanded. It wasn't a shout. It was an order. Mark sat down so hard the chair creaked. Alexander walked over to the plaintiff's table. He looked at Jessica. He looked at her red dress. He looked at the Birkin bag on the table. He looked at the Patek Philippe watch. He laughed. It was a dry, terrifying sound. Nice watch, Alexander said. I have a factory in Geneva that makes the internal springs for those. We sell them by the bucket. Jessica pulled her hand back as if she'd been burned. She tried to muster some of her earlier arrogance. I don't know who you think you are, but this is a private legal matter. Private. Alexander turned to the judge. Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption. I am Alexander Vane, Sovereign, Prince of Montverda. My daughter, Princess Sarai Vane, or Sarah, as she prefers to be called in this country, has been living under an assumed identity for her own protection and desire for a normal life. Princess. The judge sat down slowly. Yes. Alexander continued. And since my daughter is a member of the Royal House of Montverda and holds a diplomatic passport which she has graciously chosen not to use until now, this court has a conflict of interest. Mark looked at Sarah. You're a princess. But the loans, the student debt, Sarah stood up, walking to stand beside her father. She looked at Mark with pity. I took out loans because I wanted to know what it felt like to struggle, Mark. To build something real. I paid off your first business loan with my trust fund allowance, not waitress tips. I just didn't want to bruise your ego. You paid the seed money, Mark stammered. $200,000, Sarah said calmly. I routed it through an anonymous angel investor. That was me, Mark. I bought your first servers. Jessica felt sick. The room was spinning. She looked at Mark. You said she was poor. You said she was a leech. I thought she was, Mark yelled back, panic setting in. Mr. Sterling, Alexander Vane said, addressing Mark's lawyer. I suggest you look at the financial disclosures again, specifically the ones my legal team is filing right now in the federal court. One of Alexander's assistants stepped forward and dropped a thick stack of documents onto Mark's table. Thud. What is this? Sterling asked, his hands trembling as he opened the folder. That, Alexander said, is a record of fraud. You see, Mark, when you marry a woman under false pretenses, that's one thing. But when you use her money she secretly gave you to buy assets that you then hide in offshore accounts to avoid taxes, well, that becomes a federal crime. Mark's face went grey. I don't know what you're talking about. The Cayman accounts, Sarah said softly. The ones under the name Vance Holdings. You named your shell companies after your mistress while we were still married, Mark. Did you really think my family's forensic accountants wouldn't find them? Jessica gasped. You put my name on illegal accounts. Mark turned on Jessica. Shut up. You wanted the money. You wanted the lifestyle. Silence. Judge Harrison banged his gavel, though he looked thoroughly entertained. Alexander Vane leaned in close to Mark. He placed both hands on the table, leaning his massive weight forward. You flaunted your wealth, boy. You humiliated my daughter. You thought you were a king because you sold some software. Alexander smiled, and it was the scariest thing Jessica had ever seen. You are about to learn the difference between new money and old power. You played checkers, Mark. My daughter was playing chess, and Alexander straightened up, buttoning his jacket. I just flipped the board. Alexander turned to Sarah. Shall we go, darling? The helicopter is waiting on the roof. We have a lunch meeting with the governor. Sarah nodded. She looked at Jessica one last time. Jessica was clutching her Birkin bag like a life raft. Oh, Jessica, Sarah said, pausing. That bag? Jessica looked down at the red crocodile skin. It's a fake, Sarah said simply. Mark bought it from a reseller in Chinatown. I saw the receipt on his desk months ago. Real Hermes doesn't have orange stitching on the interior pocket. Jessica screamed, a guttural, horrified scream. She threw the bag at Mark. You cheap bastard! Order in the court. The judge was banging the gavel, but he was hiding a smile behind his hand. Sarah took her father's arm. They turned to walk out. But the drama wasn't over. Just as they reached the doors, the bailiff stepped forward with 2 police officers who had just entered from the rear. Mark Kensington, the officer asked. Mark stood up, sweating profusely. Yes. We have a warrant for your arrest regarding securities fraud and embezzlement. Jessica scrambled away from him. I didn't know anything. Alexander Vane stopped at the door. He didn't look back. He just checked his watch, a vintage piece worth more than the entire building. Right on time, Alexander said. But as the cuffs clicked onto Mark's wrists, Jessica Vance realized something terrifying. Mark was going to jail. The assets would be frozen. She had quit her job, given up her apartment, and burned her bridges for this man. She was alone. And she had just insulted a princess. Sarah paused. She turned back, looking at Jessica. "Jessica," Sarah called out. Jessica looked up, tears streaming down her face, mascara ruining her cheeks. "The shoes are fake too," Sarah said. Then she walked out. The scene outside the courthouse was a frenzy. Word had spread. It wasn't just a divorce hearing anymore. It was the downfall of a tech mogul and the public outing of a secret princess. The paparazzi, usually reserved for movie stars, were swarming the steps. Jessica Vance stumbled out of the revolving doors, shielding her eyes from the flashbulbs. 10 minutes ago, she had walked in like a queen. Now she was the court jester. "Jessica, is it true the bag is fake?" a reporter shouted, thrusting a microphone in her face. "Did you know about the embezzlement? Are you going to be charged as an accomplice?" Jessica pushed past them, her heels clicking frantically on the pavement. She reached for her phone to call an Uber, but her hands were shaking so badly she dropped it. The screen shattered a fitting metaphor for her life. "Taxi!" she screamed, waving her arm. Her voice cracked. She finally scrambled into a yellow cab, slamming the door shut on the cameras. "The Kensington Tower, Upper East Side. Go. Just go." As the taxi weaved through traffic, Jessica tried to calm her breathing. "It's a mistake," she told herself. "Mark will fix this. He always fixes it. He has lawyers. He has millions." She pulled out her wallet and looked at the black American Express card Mark had given her as an allowance. She needed to buy a flight, maybe to Paris, just until this blew over. She tried to book a ticket on her cracked phone screen. Transaction declined. She stared at the screen. She tried again. Card inactive. Contact issuer. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." She tried her own debit card. It had a balance of maybe $300, enough for a motel, not a flight to Europe. The taxi screeched to a halt in front of the Kensington Tower. This was Mark's crown jewel, a residential skyscraper where the cheapest apartment cost $4 million. They lived in the triplex penthouse. Jessica threw a crumpled $20 bill at the driver, all the cash she had, and ran toward the gold-plated revolving doors. She needed to get to the safe in the bedroom. There was cash there, jewelry. The real stuff, not the fakes Sarah had humiliated her with. But the revolving door didn't move. She pushed harder. Nothing. "Jerry!" she yelled, banging on the glass. She saw the doorman, a man in his 50s named Jerry, standing inside. She had treated Jerry like dirt for 2 years. She never tipped him at Christmas. She complained if he didn't open the door fast enough. She once tried to get him fired because he made eye contact with her. Jerry looked at her. He slowly walked over to the glass. He didn't open the door. "Let me in." "My key fob isn't working." Jessica shrieked, her voice muffled by the thick glass. Jerry shook his head slowly. He pointed to a piece of paper taped to the glass from the inside. "Eviction notice. Pursuant to court order 99C. All access to Penthouse A is revoked immediately." "You can't do this," Jessica yelled. "I live here. My clothes are in there." Jerry cracked the side door open just an inch. "Sorry, Miss Vance. Management's orders. No unauthorized personnel." "I'm not unauthorized, you idiot. I'm Mark Kensington's fiancée." "Mr. Kensington doesn't own the building anymore," Jerry said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. Actually, turns out he never really owned the penthouse either. It was a corporate lease. "Who owns it then?" Jessica demanded. "I'll call the landlord right now." Jerry chuckled. You really don't know. He pointed to the brass plaque on the wall, one that had always been there, but Jessica had never bothered to read. It listed the property management company, managed by Vane Real Estate Trust, a subsidiary of Vane Industries. Jessica froze. The blood drained from her face. Vane, she whispered. Sarah's father. Ms. Sarah called about 10 minutes ago, Jerry said, looking more cheerful than he had in years. She said that since the lease was in Mr. Kensington's name, and he is currently indisposed, the property reverts to the owner. She also mentioned that any personal items left inside are now considered collateral against unpaid rent. My clothes, Jessica gasped. My shoes. Collateral, Jerry repeated. But she did leave something for you. Jerry reached behind the desk and pulled out a small plastic grocery bag. He tossed it through the crack in the door. It landed on the sidewalk at Jessica's feet. Jessica opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a pair of cheap rubber flip-flops. She said those heels looked uncomfortable, Jerry said. And since they're fake anyway, you shouldn't mind swapping them. Jerry closed the door and locked it. Jessica Vance stood on the sidewalk of Park Avenue, surrounded by billionaires holding a plastic bag with $5 flip-flops inside. It started to rain. She looked at her phone. A text message came through from her best friend, Chloe. Hey, just saw the news. Don't come to the gala tonight. It's invite only and well, you know. Good luck. Jessica sank to her knees on the wet concrete. The city was loud, but her world was silent. She had played the game of status, and she had lost to the woman who owned the board. Mark Kensington was a man who spent $3,000 a month on skin creams. He was a man who required his sheets to be 1,000 thread count Egyptian cotton. Now he was wearing an orange jumpsuit that smelled like industrial bleach and someone else's sweat. He sat in a small concrete room, his wrists handcuffed to a metal table. He had been there for 24 hours. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten the bologna sandwich they slid through the slot. The door buzzed and opened. Mark shot up, expecting Robert Sterling, his high-powered attorney. Robert, finally get me out of here. The bail hearing is... Mark stopped. It wasn't Robert Sterling. It was Sarah. She walked into the interrogation room, looking like royalty. The grey cardigan was gone. She was wearing a tailored navy blazer, white trousers and heels that clicked with authority. Her hair was down, cascading over her shoulders in waves. She looked vibrant, powerful. She sat down opposite him. She didn't have a lawyer with her. She didn't need one. Sarah. Mark breathed out. He tried to summon his old arrogance, but it faltered. What are you doing here? Did you come to gloat? I came to bring you this, Sarah said calmly. She slid a single piece of paper across the metal table. Mark looked at it. It was a letter of resignation from Robert Sterling. He quit, Mark shouted. He can't quit. I paid him a retainer. You paid him with funds from the Kensington Growth Fund, Sarah corrected, which as of yesterday has been frozen by the SEC due to suspected money laundering. Sterling can't accept dirty money, Mark. He'd lose his license, so you currently have no counsel. Mark slumped back in his chair. Sarah, babe, listen, we can fix this. Talk to your dad. Tell him to call off the dogs. I'll give you half. I'll give you 70% of the company. Sarah laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh, which made it worse. It was a pitying laugh. Mark, you still don't understand, she said, folding her hands on the table. You don't have 70% of the company to give. I built Kensington Tech. Mark slammed his cuffed hands on the table. I wrote the code. You wrote the front-end interface, Sarah said quietly. Who wrote the back-end algorithm? Mark, who stayed up until 400 a.m., fixing your bugs while you were out networking at bars. Mark went silent. He looked away. I did, Sarah said. And do you remember the angel investor contract, the one you signed 10 years ago for that first $200,000? The Vesta Group, Mark muttered. Yeah. So what? Vesta is an acronym, Sarah explained. Vane Estate Strategic Tech Assets. It's my private trust, and Clause 14, Section B of that contract states that in the event of the founder's criminal indictment or gross misuse of funds, all intellectual property rights revert to the investor. Mark's eyes widened until the whites showed all around. No. That's standard boilerplate. It's never enforced. It is today, Sarah said. My lawyers executed the clause this morning. I own the code mark. I own the patent. I own the brand. Kensington Tech doesn't exist anymore. By Monday, it will be rebranded as Vane Digital. Mark felt like he couldn't breathe. The walls of the small room were closing in. You stole my company. I repossessed my property, Sarah said coldly. You were just the manager, and you were a bad one. She stood up and walked to the heavy steel door. She knocked on it for the guard. Sarah, wait. Mark was crying now. Genuine tears of terror. What happens to me? I'm facing 20 years. The fraud, the embezzlement. Sarah, please, I'm your husband. Sarah paused with her hand on the door. She didn't turn around. You ceased being my husband the moment you used our anniversary dinner money to buy Jessica a bracelet, she said. I kept the receipt, Mark. I kept every receipt for 10 years. I'm sorry, Mark wailed. I'm sorry I called you a mouse. I'm sorry. Sarah turned then. Her blue eyes were dry and clear. You were right about one thing, Mark. I was a mouse. I hid in the corners. I let you take the credit. I let you shine because I loved you, and I thought you needed the confidence. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a whisper that was louder than a scream. But you forgot what happens when you corner a mouse. You forgot that my father didn't raise a victim. He raised a Vane. And we don't get mad, Mark. We get even. The guard opened the door. Enjoy the trial, Sarah said. I heard the federal prosecutors are looking to make an example out of you. Something about arrogant tech bros being unpopular with juries these days. She walked out into the hallway, the fluorescent lights catching the diamond earrings she was finally wearing again, heirlooms from her grandmother, the late Queen. Mark was left alone in the silence of the cell. He looked down at the metal table where his reflection was distorted and grey. He had wanted a life of drama, of high stakes of royalty. He had gotten exactly what he wished for. Jessica Vance was no longer living in a penthouse overlooking Central Park. She was living in her childhood bedroom in a cramped duplex in the Bronx, surrounded by posters of boy bands she had loved when she was 15. Her father, a retired sanitation worker named Frank, wouldn't even look at her during dinner. The shame of having his daughter splashed across the New York Post as the gold-digging accomplice was too much for him. Jessica sat on her twin bed, staring at her phone. She had been trying to sell her designer clothes on eBay to pay for a lawyer. Ding! A notification popped up. User Luxury Lover 99 has opened a dispute. Item is counterfeit. The Louboutins have red paint, not red soles, demanding refund. Jessica threw the phone against the wall. Even the gifts Mark had given her, the ones she thought were genuine apologies for his temper, were fake. everything was a lie. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from a blocked number. She picked it up, hoping it was a talent agent. "Jessica." It was Mark's voice. It sounded tinny, echoing from the prison payphone. "Don't call me," Jessica hissed. "My lawyer said I shouldn't talk to you." "Your lawyer is a public defender who smells like mothballs," Mark snapped. "Listen to me, Jess. We need to get our stories straight. The trial starts in 3 weeks. If we stick together, we can blame the accountant. We can say Sterling set us up." "Sterling resigned," Jessica reminded him, "and the accountant has immunity because he turned state's evidence against you last week." "We can fix it." Mark sounded manic. "I'm writing a memoir in here, The Titan Behind Bars. It's going to be a bestseller. I'll buy you a new car. Just tell the jury that you handled the finances. Tell them I was too busy being a creative genius to look at the bank statements." Jessica went cold. "You want me to take the fall, not the fall, babe. Just, the responsibility. You're sympathetic. You're a woman. The jury will go easy on you. If I get convicted, the company dies. If I walk, I can rebuild and take care of you." Jessica looked around her basement bedroom. She looked at the fake shoes. She remembered Sarah's cool, calm voice telling her the bag was worthless. "You want me to go to jail for you?" Jessica whispered. "After you humiliated me? After you let me get evicted?" "It's a strategy," Mark yelled. "Don't be selfish, Jessica." "Selfish?" Jessica let out a bitter laugh. "You know what, Mark, I think I will tell the truth, but not the version you want. Jessica, don't you dare. If you flip on me, I'll tell them about the Cayman accounts you signed for." "They already know, Mark," Jessica screamed. "Sarah's father found everything. There are no secrets left." She hung up. Her hands were shaking. She realized then that there was no us. There was only survival. She grabbed her coat and ran out the door. She wasn't going to meet Mark's lawyer. She was going to the district attorney's office. She was going to sing like a canary. It was Valentine's Day, but there was no love in courtroom 402. The trial had been going on for 2 weeks. The prosecution, led by a ruthless U.S. attorney named David Ross, had methodically dismantled Mark's empire. They showed charts of money flowing from Kensington Tech into shell companies with names like Red Dress LLC and JV Luxury. But the climax came when the defense called their witnesses. Mark Kensington took the stand first. He wore a cheap suit, but he tried to project the image of a misunderstood genius. "Mr. Kensington," his public defender asked, "did you knowingly defraud your investors?" "Absolutely not," Mark said, turning to smile charmingly at the jury. "I am a visionary. Details, numbers, those aren't my strong suit. I trusted people. I trusted my wife, Sarah. I trusted my girlfriend, Jessica. If money was moved, it was done without my direct knowledge. I was too busy coding the future." A murmur went through the crowd. He was blaming the women. Then it was time for cross-examination. The prosecutor, Mr. Ross, stood up. He didn't hold a notepad. He held a remote control. "Mr. Kensington, you say you were too busy coding. Is that right?" "Yes, sir. 18 hours a day." "Can you explain this video, then?" Ross pointed to the large screen on the wall. A video began to play. It was security footage from inside the Kensington Tech Executive Suite. It was dated 3 days before the IPO launch. In the video, Mark was playing an online video game, his feet up on the desk, holding a beer. Sarah was visible in the background, frantically typing on 3 different monitors, her hair messy, clearly exhausted. Audio from video Mark. Babe, get me another beer, and finish that patch. If the server crashes, it's on you. Sarah. Mark, please help me. The code is unstable. Mark. That's why I keep you around. You're the worker bee. I'm the face. The video ended. The courtroom was dead silent. Mark's face was purple. That is out of context. The context seems clear, Ross said. You weren't the genius, Mr. Kensington. You were the mascot. Mark sputtered, looking for an ally. He looked at Jessica, who was sitting at the defense table as a co-defendant. Mark pointed a trembling finger at Jessica. She spent the money. Look at her. She's obsessed with luxury. She forced me to embezzle. Jessica stood up, knocking her chair over. Her lawyer tried to grab her, but she broke free. I forced you! Jessica shrieked, ignoring the judge's gavel. You told me you were a billionaire. You told me the money was yours. I have text messages, Mark. Sit down. Judge Stone banged the gavel. Ms. Vance, take the stand if you wish to testify. I will. Jessica marched to the witness box. She was sworn in. She didn't wait for a question. He has a spreadsheet, Jessica told the jury, breathless. On his private cloud. It's called The Bait. He tracks women based on their credit scores and family inheritance. He targeted Sarah because he thought she was a scholarship student he could control. He targeted me because he thought I was dumb enough to believe his lies. Objection, Mark yelled from his seat. She's lying. She's a gold digger. I am, Jessica cried out, tears streaming down her face. I am a gold digger. I wanted his money, but there was no money. He bought my engagement ring on a credit card opened in his mother's name. He stole his own mother's identity. The jury gasped. The press gallery was typing furiously. And one more thing. Jessica sobbed, looking at Sarah, who sat in the front row, immaculate and unmovable. The night before the divorce hearing, Mark tried to hire someone to plant drugs in Sarah's car. The room erupted. Order, order! Judge Stone was shouting. Mark stood up, his eyes wild. You traitor! You promised me Paris! Jessica screamed back. You gave me the Bronx! Sarah Vane watched it all from the gallery. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She simply watched the two people who had tried to destroy her tear each other apart like starving wolves. Her father, Alexander, leaned over and whispered, Never interrupt your enemy when they are making a mistake. I know, Papa, Sarah whispered back. I'm just enjoying the show. 3 days later, the jury returned. It took them only 2 hours to deliberate. We find the defendant Mark Kensington guilty on all counts. We find the defendant Jessica Vance guilty on all counts. Mark didn't scream this time. He just stared at the wall, catatonic. The visionary was gone. The fraud was exposed. But as the bailiffs led him away to await sentencing, Mark looked back one last time. He saw Sarah standing at the back of the room. She held up a hand, waving slightly. It wasn't a wave of goodbye. It was a wave of dismissal. The King of Steel and his daughter walked out of the courthouse into a waiting fleet of black SUVs, leaving the wreckage of the new money pretenders behind them. The air inside Federal District Courtroom 7B smelled of old wood floor wax and ruined lives. It was the kind of silence that wasn't empty. It was heavy, pressing down on the lungs of everyone present. Mark Kensington sat at the defense table, a ghost of the man who had once graced the cover of Forbes. The bespoke Italian wool suits were a distant memory. replaced by a ill-fitting charcoal-grey polyester suit his court-appointed lawyer had purchased from a department store clearance rack. It hung loosely on his frame. He had lost nearly 30 pounds in the 6 months he had spent in remand at the Metropolitan Detention Centre. His skin was sallow, his eyes sunken and darting nervously around the room. The confident smirk that had defined his career was gone, replaced by a permanent expression of terror. 3 chairs away sat Jessica Vance. If Mark looked defeated, Jessica looked eroded. The influencer glow was extinguished. Her hair, once a carefully maintained platinum blonde, was now a harsh, brassy yellow, with 3 inches of dark roots, showing a visible timeline of her downfall. She wore a conservative black skirt and a white blouse that was buttoned to her chin, an attempt to look like a librarian, rather than the woman who had slapped a fake Birkin bag onto a divorce table. She stared at her hands, refusing to look at Mark, the man who had promised her the world and delivered her a prison cell. The gallery was packed to capacity. Reporters from the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and every major tabloid were squeezed onto the wooden benches. Sketch artists were furiously drawing the defendants' miserable expressions. But in the front row, occupying the reserved section, usually meant for victims' families, sat 2 figures who commanded the room without saying a word. Alexander Vane sat like a carved statue of judgment, his arms crossed over his chest. He wore a dark navy suit that likely cost more than the combined annual salaries of the prosecution team. Beside him sat Sarah Vane. She did not look like the mouse Mark had ridiculed. She did not look like the woman in the grey cardigan. She wore a suit of stark, blinding white, sharp-tailored and immaculate. It was a power suit, the kind worn by heads of state. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek, high ponytail that emphasized her high cheekbones and cold sapphire eyes. She sat with her spine straight, her hands resting gently on a leather portfolio. She looked serene. It was the serenity of the executioner before the blade drops. "All rise!" The bailiff bellowed, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. Judge Marilyn Stone entered. In the legal world, she was known as the Iron Maiden. She didn't believe in rehabilitation for white-collar criminals. She believed in consequences. She took her seat, adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses, and stared down at the 2 defendants. "Mark Kensington." Judge Stone began, her voice dry and scratching like sandpaper. "You stand before this court, convicted of 12 counts of securities fraud, 4 counts of wire fraud, 1 count of embezzlement and obstruction of justice. You created a house of cards, Mr. Kensington. You took money from hard-working people, pension funds, small investors, and even your own wife to fund a lifestyle of grotesque excess." Mark stood up, his legs trembling so violently the table shook. "Your Honor, please, I got lost. The pressure, I wanted to succeed. I can pay it back. I swear, give me time, and I will pay every cent back." "Time is exactly what I am going to give you," Judge Stone said, her eyes narrowing. "But not to make money." She opened the folder in front of her. The room held its breath. "For the crimes committed, and for the sheer arrogance displayed during these proceedings, attempting to blame your co-defendant, attempting to blame your wife, I sentence you to 14 years in federal prison." Mark let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. 14 years. He would be nearly 50 when he got out. "You will serve a minimum of 85% of your sentence before being eligible for parole," Stone continued ruthlessly. "Furthermore, you are ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $45 million. This represents the total capital stolen from investors plus penalties. Mark collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. His life was over. "Jessica Vance," the judge called out. Jessica stood up, weeping openly. "I didn't know I was just the girlfriend. He told me he was rich." "The jury found otherwise," Stone said, unmoved. "You signed the checks for the shell companies. You enjoyed the spoils of the theft. Ignorance is not a defense when you are holding the pen. I sentence you to 4 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation." Jessica screamed a shrill, piercing sound that made the reporters wince. "Order!" Stone banged her gavel. "Now, regarding the victim impact statements, I understand the primary victim, Ms. Eravane, wishes to address the court." Sarah stood up. The rustle of her white suit was the only sound in the room. She walked to the podium, her heels clicking with a rhythmic, terrifying precision. She didn't look at the judge immediately. She turned her body slightly facing Mark. Mark looked up. His eyes were wet, red-rimmed, and filled with a desperate, pathetic hope. "Sarah," he whispered loud enough for the front row to hear. "Sarah, please, help me. I was your husband. We had good times, didn't we? You have the power. You can ask for leniency. Please, don't let me die in there." The courtroom watched. Would the princess show mercy? Sarah adjusted the microphone. Her voice was soft, melodic, and utterly chilling. "Your Honor," Sarah said, addressing the bench but keeping her eyes locked on Mark, "Mr. Kensington asks for mercy based on our history. He claims he was my husband, but a husband is a partner. Mr. Kensington was a parasite." She opened her leather portfolio. "I'm not here to ask for leniency, Your Honor, nor am I here to ask for a harsher sentence. The 14 years are sufficient to remove him from society. I am here to address the matter of restitution." Judge Stone raised an eyebrow. "Go on, Ms. Vane." "The court has ordered Mr. Kensington to pay $45 million to the victims," Sarah stated. "However, as of this morning, there are no other victims." Mark blinked, confused. "What? Over the last 3 weeks?" Sarah continued, pulling out a stack of notarized documents. "My holding company, Vane Capital, has contacted every single minor investor defrauded by Kensington Tech. I have reimbursed them 100 cents on the dollar. I have bought out their claims." A murmur of shock went through the gallery. That was tens of millions of dollars paid out of pocket. "Why would you do that?" Mark stammered. To save me." Sarah finally smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a shark sensing blood in the water. "No, Mark, I didn't do it to save you. I did it to consolidate the debt." She handed the documents to the bailiff to pass to the judge. "Since I am now the sole holder of the debt, the $45 million in restitution is owed entirely to me. And unlike the federal government or a bank, I am not interested in writing this off as a bad loss. I have filed a civil lien against you, Mark. It is already approved." "A lien?" Mark asked, his voice shaking. "It means," Sarah said, stepping closer to the railing, "that when you walk out of prison in 14 years, you will not be free. You will be 48 years old, a convicted felon with no job prospects, and you will owe me $45 million. Mark went pale, his skin taking on the color of ash. "I have structured the judgment so that the interest is frozen," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried like a gunshot. "I don't want the debt to grow so big you give up. I want it to sit there exactly at $45 million. Do you know what that means, Mark?" Mark shook his head, tears streaming down his face. It means I will garnish every paycheck you ever earn for the rest of your life, Sarah said. If you get a job flipping burgers, I take 90%. If you find a $20 bill on the sidewalk, 18 of it belongs to me. You will never own a car. You will never own a home. You will never even own a credit card. You are effectively my indentured servant until the day you die. Mark stared at her in horror. She hadn't just locked him up. She had erased his future. She had ensured that even in freedom he would be in chains. You can't do that, Mark whispered. That's cruel. Cruelty is spending your wife's inheritance on a mistress and calling your wife a mouse, Sarah replied coolly. This is just accounting. She turned her gaze to Jessica. Jessica shrank back in her seat, trying to make herself invisible. I have nothing, Jessica sobbed. You can't take money from me. I have nothing. I know, Jessica. Sarah said, her tone shifting from icy to almost pitying. And truthfully, you aren't worth the legal fees to sue. Jessica let out a breath of relief. However, Sarah said, pausing for effect, I did notice that your parents, Frank and Linda, lovely people, have been struggling to pay their rent in the Bronx since you moved back in and drained their savings for your legal defense. Jessica's eyes widened. Leave them alone. Oh, I haven't touched them, Sarah said innocently. But the building they live in, 402 Sycamore Avenue, it was on the market, a distressed asset. Vane Real Estate Trust closed on the property yesterday. Jessica gripped the edge of the table. You bought my parents' building. I'm your landlord now, Jessica, Sarah said, and I have a very strict policy regarding tenants with criminal records living on the premises. But because I'm generous, I won't evict them. Yet. Sarah leaned in. But when you get out in 4 years, Jessica, don't think about moving back home. If you set one foot in that building, if you try to live on my property, I will evict your parents so fast their heads will spin. You are homeless, effectively banned from the only roof you have left. You're a monster, Jessica shrieked. I am a Vane, Sarah corrected, and we protect our own. Sarah closed her portfolio. She looked at the judge. Thank you, Your Honor. I have nothing further. As Sarah turned to leave, Mark lunged forward, restrained only by the heavy chains connected to the floor. Sarah. Wait. I love you. I still love you. He screamed a desperate, delusional lie. Sarah stopped. She didn't turn around. She simply reached into her purse and pulled out a small object. She tossed it over her shoulder. It landed on the defense table with a hollow clatter. It was a cheap plastic lighter. Burn the memoir, Mark, she said. Nobody wants to read a book by a loser. Alexander Vane stood up, towering over the courtroom. He placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder, shielding her from the cameras that were flashing wildly. They walked down the center aisle, parting the sea of reporters like royalty. Behind them, the sounds of Mark sobbing and Jessica screaming were drowned out by the heavy thud of the courtroom doors closing, sealing their fate forever. 6 months later. The New York Metropolitan Museum of Art was bathed in the glow of 1,000 flashbulbs. It was the night of the Global Tech Innovators Gala. A sleek black limousine pulled up to the red carpet. The door opened, and a hush fell over the crowd. Sarah Vane stepped out. She was breathtaking. She wore a gown of midnight blue velvet, off the shoulder, shimmering with thousands of tiny crystals that looked like from the star. Around her neck sat the Vane sapphires, a necklace that hadn't been seen in public for 50 years. She didn't walk with her head down. She didn't hide in a grey cardigan. She walked with the grace of a woman who had walked through fire and come out made of steel. Ms. Vane, Ms. Vane. A reporter from Vanity Fair thrust a microphone toward her. Your company Vane Digital just posted record profits for the quarter. How does it feel to be the most powerful woman in tech? Sarah stopped and smiled. It was a genuine smile this time. It feels correct. And Ms. Vane, another reporter shouted, do you have any comment on the news from upstate your ex-husband was transferred to maximum security yesterday after a fight in the yard? Sarah paused. The camera zoomed in on her face. For a split second, there was a flicker of recognition. A memory of a man who had once told her she was nothing. Then the mask of the Queen slid into place. Who? Sarah asked. She didn't wait for an answer. She turned and ascended the stairs. Her blue velvet train trailing behind her like royal robes, leaving the past where it belonged in the dark, while she stepped into the light. The story of Sarah and Mark is a brutal reminder of a simple truth. Arrogance is the most expensive luxury in the world, and eventually everyone receives the bill. Mark and Jessica mistook silence for weakness and kindness for stupidity. They thought the lack of flash meant a lack of cash, failing to realize that true power doesn't need to shout it whispers. In the end, the karma wasn't just that they went to prison. It was that they lost their humanity in pursuit of a status they never earned. Sarah's victory wasn't in the money she had, but in the dignity she kept. If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story about karma hitting back. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder to stay humble. Thanks for watching.